Thanks, Audrey, and thanks again to everyone for joining us today for this important discussion. As we all know, South Korea is a highly innovative economy, rapidly rolled out 5G across its society, and beyond the technology, really have those technological innovations develop additional systems like smart cities, and also developed a governance framework that protected both individual privacy concerns and allowed the use of big data. And it's interesting because that puts South Korea potentially in a position to share those models and those issues with the rest of the region as we think about how these new technologies can really shape our societies and economies. Um, Given the nature of those questions and the importance of those questions, we've spent a couple of years working on these issues at NBR, and we really means Clara Gillespie here, who's the author of a couple of studies, one that was published last year and one that will be coming out later this year, that look very explicitly at the role of 5G in South Korea's development and the potential for South Korea to play a leadership role in 5G and innovation across the Asia-Pacific region. And that's the focus of our conversation today. Um, Before we begin that, I just have two housekeeping things to offer this as we get started. First is to say thank you very much to the Korea Foundation, which provided financial support for Clara's study, allowed her to get to Korea and do field research. And as a longtime supporter of NBR's research work, we're very appreciative of that backing. And secondly, to introduce Clara herself. Clara was actually a longtime colleague of mine here at NBR, previously ran our energy and trade work for us. And then after she left NBR, has spent several years working in visiting fellowship positions across the region, in India in 2019-20, and in Taiwan in 2020, and spent the first half of this year actually in Korea, where she completed some field research. And so the format today is we're going to have Clara make some remarks and share some of the insights from her study. I'll pose a few questions to her, and as Audrey mentioned, if you have additional questions for Clara, please channel those through the chat and I'll incorporate those into my questions of Clara. And then Clara will bring in our other two expert speakers today and widen the conversation as we round out our discussion. But Clara, with that, over to you. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Michael. And really, to dive right in, I want to begin by underscoring that point that you mentioned in your introduction, which is to say that South Korea really already has been a technological leader by a number of measures in the 5G era. On infrastructure, it's not only led on its domestic rollout, but even as China, Japan, Australia have begun to stand up their 5G networks. South Korea has continued to lead both in pace and overall degree of domestic adoption, something that's expected to remain true through at least mid-decade. On digital transformation as well, it's a country where 95% of the adult population owns a smartphone, and where it's increasingly become a key tool, not just for communication and financial transactions, but also for how people are able to access public services, something that's been especially critical in this past year, where we've all been, myself included at the moment, moving to remote work in various ways. And then there's also the talent dimension, which here in particular, South Korea has really punched above its weight in the technological space. The country accounts for less than 1% of global population, but currently is responsible for about 25% of all 5G patents. It's also home to some of the world's most competitive brands in this space, including companies such as Hyundai and Samsung, Samsung in particular, which has emerged as a major competitor to Huawei in 5G development. And all of this provides a really solid foundation for thinking about how you move forward with this idea of leadership as not just a domestic consideration, but something where South Korea is looking to expand its role in the larger region, and you have this increasingly integrated global market in technology as well, where it's not just domestic factors that matter. It really is this global picture for thinking about what shapes demand, supply, and other considerations. And in terms of how you build on this foundation, Seoul and the Moon administration in particular has really looked to move forward along two tracks in particular. And the first involves some additional work in getting its own house in order. I mentioned a lot of the positives that it has in this foundation for technological leadership. There are some also very specific and real areas where developers in the country have struggled in bringing new products to market, particularly when it comes to those that involve leveraging data, either personal, sensitive, or sometimes various forms of what we might consider public data in various spaces. This includes in fields like not only artificial intelligence, but also things like digital healthcare, where the country's strengths across a number of fronts should really position it to be a natural leader in this space. And some of these challenges have to do with some longstanding questions about how you invest better in research and development, about how you further strengthen human capacity. There are also some areas where you could say the challenge is not policy itself, but rather areas where policy has been quiet, or things where really only governments can act, or governments primarily can act, that the multiple administrations have not really led on in the way that they could. Here in particular, I'm thinking about some of the criticisms that the OECD and others have noticed on South Korea's challenges in building up database infrastructure at a national level that not only public officials can tap into, but researchers and developers in the private sector, other academics can access to. But also layered on top of that as well, very specific areas where public policy itself has also presented a barrier to further development, where sometimes it's a very binary situation where either laws will allow you to do certain things or they won't. And in particular here, I'm thinking about South Korea's framework around data protection and privacy. In some ways, the country is well ahead of the United States, others who are now looking at this issue of how you come up with a comprehensive national policy. There are a number of strengths that the system does have, including in being responsive to public concerns, which for democracy is a very challenging question of how you balance a number of dynamics here, but also specific questions and limitations on things like how you can give user consent with individual pieces of data, which, depending on how that functions, can have a real tangible impact on how new products can be built that involve multiple actors sharing information, applications in telemedicine, for example, or other smart-based platforms. And, in this context, 2020 in particular really was a watershed year in terms of change and movement on a number of areas like these that we've been talking about for a number of years. It kicked off with a major amendment to the country's three most significant data protection law, or data laws, including this data protection law I mentioned, that by and large both made it easier to have pathways for anonymizing data as an alternate tool rather than just shutting down transactions, allowing protection by other means so that developers could build new products. It involved some changes to further clarify and empower the role of the country's Personal Information Protection Commission, which prevents a little bit of the question of, does bureaucracy itself and sometimes ambiguous roles serve as another barriers to moving forward with approvals and process? And I think each of these changes on their own would have made 2020 already a fairly significant year for South Korea moving forward on some of these fronts. But then you have, not long after these amendments were passed, the pandemic hit. And the pandemic, as we've talked about at MER in a number of conversations, really accelerated digital transformations across the region on a number of fronts. And for South Korea, that was already in some ways much farther ahead in terms of domestic adoption. It served to help further address some of those last mile barriers in a couple of cases. So again, very strong foundation for domestic access to these tools, but even still, it increased a little bit above that 95% threshold that we mentioned. There were some specific barriers on products that were being delivered, particularly in the digital healthcare space, questions about restrictions on telemedicine, that again, the necessity of having to adapt to COVID allowed for some additional changes at the regulatory level, in line with what was already technically possible with the country's governance frameworks. And then you also have some bigger, more innovative pushes that the country made as well, right? So In early last year, President Moon Jae-in declared that South Korea was not going to move towards lockdowns as other countries had. It was going to lead in a technology-led approach to the crisis, leveraging different forms of information for actually identifying and tracing the spread of COVID and then further responding. I've described this in previous context as the most ambitious biosurveillance program ever undertaken in a democracy. And it really is for a number of ways. I know that our speaker on our next panel will speak a little bit more of this, but I do want to stress the way in which some of these tools that drew on GPS information, that combined it with data from other sources and other databases, really showed some of the potential for leveraging big data in line with a public goal. Really demonstrating not just the abstract benefit of getting some of these policies right, but also how you can leverage them in real terms. It also moved South Korea a little bit out of that space of just talking about getting its house in order in terms of addressing challenges and barriers, to more aggressively thinking about areas where Seoul could lead in terms of providing its own template for how it had used information technology on a number of fronts, but also lead in terms of thinking about how when we exit COVID, how we retain some of the best practices that we've developed over the last year on data governance, on leveraging teleworking, other tools, reducing barriers to some of their use, while also still thinking about setting that high standard and barrier for thinking about data protection, addressing other very real threats, be they cybersecurity, surveillance, or other means that might harm individual interests. All of that helps to support this kind of second track that's going along concurrently with this getting the house in order, which is really Seoul's efforts to expand its international footprint and outreach on these areas. It's a little strange to talk about getting some of the house in order and not mention the international dimension to this element, because, you know, in terms of how Seoul has looked at strengthening its data governance regime in particular, international engagement, not only with the US, but European Union and others, has been a really important part and part of the process of how they've made decisions on these factors. But even still, that's a little bit more of a collaborative dialogue rather than thinking about areas where Seoul wants to be out ahead, in front, and leading. And in this context, you know, it's easy to see, again, with that 1% of the population, how if you're going to be successful with in this space, you really have to think about the market as global. And to that end, similar to how the United States and Japan have announced their own kind of Indo-Pacific strategies for reaching out to the wider region, so too has the Moon Jae-in administration. I think it's fair to say that this policy in particular, which does have a really significant, important digital component to it, has, relative to the efforts of US, Japan, China, and others, in some ways been playing a bit from behind. South Korea's relationships with the region in particular, within ASEAN, have been historically limited a bit more to Vietnam and to a certain extent Myanmar. For South Asia, Korea-India relations are well below the depth of exchanges that you see in the United States or even Japan, India, and others. There are some areas, though, where this is changing in particular, and kind of interesting for signaling what may be further ahead. So in particular, in the last year and a half, you've seen, even with all the restrictions that you do have on travel, on dialogues, South Korea finding way to expand its exchanges with ASEAN in particular, doubling down on the importance of ASEAN's centrality to help highlight both its case studies as potential models that may be adapted for smart cities legislation, for its policies on digital containment of COVID, but also really putting investment, other resources behind these policies as well. India, Moon Jae-in has emphasized that with his kind of next generation of the New Southern Policy, what he's calling as the New Southern Policy Plus, that there's an awareness that the relations with India have not been as deep, that they could be deeper, for data governance in particular, it's a really interesting time because India is very actively looking at how it wants to stand up its own national system, where its conversations with the United States and its review of practices in both the EU and China have been quite detailed. In my own research, I found South Korea has not been as involved in those conversations yet, and it's an open opportunity of how you expand and grow on that. And in terms of how you do expand and grow on that, there's a lot that can be done in these sort of mini lateral spaces. There's a lot more that could be done and could move faster by thinking about some of the efforts to grow and expand partnerships and other dialogues. Here, this is an area where I want to inject a little bit of maybe cautious optimism or a little bit more reserved on some of the challenges in the way ahead. When we think about the question of both South Korea's natural strategic allies and partners, and then the countries in which it has very close and similar alignment with on digital issues or values related to digital development in particular, values such as rule of law, importance of democracy, again, thinking about this privacy, consent, individual rights in these space, there's sometimes a disconnect between the two sides of the equation. So, Japan is one example where there's a lot of natural alignment on some of these issues on the digital side, but the political will at the top level has not always been there, or it's been a complicated relationship in a way that does complicate how you move forward. Taiwan, of course, is another example where this comes up frequently of significant potential, but have not on the digital side, but have not always been as close on the policy front. And again, complicated by a number of factors, including South Korea's relations with China as well. And then, of course, there's the United States in this space. Again, both allies and countries that have very shared similar digital interests on a number of fronts that hasn't always translated into forward momentum on what could be done together in the region. Obviously, one of the areas that stands out here is the significant disagreement that the United States and South Korea have had over the past couple of years on the role of Huawei and Chinese firms in particular in 5G development. But there are also important divergences between the US and South Korea on a number of more fundamental questions about best practices in data protection as well, including when it comes to cross-border data flows. This too is an area where some things are changing. I think for many of us who've been following the conversations between President Moon and Biden, the leader statement that came out of their meeting last month had a number of pleasant surprises included in it. Most of the issues that were discussed in there were issues that I think observers had anticipated being on the agenda, but not issues that we were necessarily expecting to have an agreement be issued on it. So for example, you see a number of comments not only on working together in 5G and beyond, but some specific questions related to Open RAN standards and ways that we might collaborate, again, on thinking about data protection and security as not just a question of who the vendors are, but also a question of how you audit, review, and ensure accountability in some of these systems and how they're developed, particularly in thinking about interoperability as a way that gives countries flexibility in the systems they develop. Again, some of this is early in a number of ways. I know I am kind of keen to see how this develops. While it's a very positive statement, there's a lot more that needs to be done to move forward on this space, not just in the US context or US-Korea context, but also in bringing others into it. And there's much more I could say on that there, but maybe that's a good place to end and kind of lead into our discussion.
Thanks, Clara. If I may, I'm going to just pose a couple of questions to you before you bring in Troy and Guanhu here. You mentioned these three sort of new laws that came into place, sort of really that bolstering of the governance regime within South Korea. And you've just spent the last 6 months or so on the ground there doing your research. Can you tell us a little more about the relationship between the South Korean companies and the government? So what I heard you say early on was that successive administrations in Seoul have sort of been moving in fits and starts in terms of building that governance framework in place. I'd like to understand how you saw those dynamics between the government building the structure, the role of civil society in shaping that, and the role of the companies. And I'm curious if you saw in Korea some of the same dynamics that we've seen, say, within the US or between the US and Europe, in terms of how there's sometimes a tenser relationship between the public policy side and the commercial business side of these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might expand that slightly to say there's definitely an important role for South Korean companies in particular in that space, but US and other international firms through the various chambers and other forums have also been very active and involved in these conversations. Um, it is something where the other dynamic I'd add into this is you have both the firms and you have labor unions and other interest group, which sometimes have aligned interests, sometimes do not have aligned interests. And one of the tensions I'll highlight here, two of the tensions I'll highlight here in particular, involve a couple of fields such as ride sharing, where you have a tension between companies that want to develop a product, and then you have a tension between labor unions, taxi unions in particular, that are very concerned about the impact that new technologies will have on jobs or job losses in particular, or if not the loss of jobs themselves, the loss of quality jobs, impacts on return on for drivers in particular. So in that space, you see some of the protective legislation, the restrictions on these spaces as playing out as not just a question of what products could be built or what's necessary to get to an end state, but actively trying to slow down the development of some products that might not be in your interests. Some of that has shifted a little bit more. And I think, going into 2020, the debates that we'd been seeing had not been new. What was new was the actual momentum on them. And I think in that space, something that I observed firsthand was much more vocal conversations on industry, not just Korean, but US and others, advocating for specific changes in policy, saying in particular, there are questions about how we can tap into some of these databases, questions about where there is differential treatment between the private sector and the government in terms of how we're viewed under PIPA and legislation. These are elements short of some of the bigger questions that you can move on and that have a little bit more latitude to move on. COVID in particular, with some of the impacts and kind of the by necessity modifications, meant you still have some of these tensions and dynamics playing out, but you do have a little bit more vocal public support and blessing behind the idea of moving forward with some of these regulatory changes. So for the second example I wanted to mention was telemedicine, where again, you have developers who are very keen to move forward on products, but you have had attention in some of the medical associations, other unions on saying, we shouldn't move forward too quickly with telemedicine, again, if this might undermine a goal of, say, quality healthcare in particular. And have been very successful on this front of advocating for this publicly. But when by necessity you're in a year where everything moves much more to remote, much more public support for some of these policy changes. So the industry side is influential on that. Sometimes it's more or less influential. There have been critiques, I know, among some of the critics of the Moon administration that he has not always been as responsive to the concerns of industry. But there has been much more of a natural alignment between both policy, industry, and then also the kind of third factor of the public in the last year that's allowed some of these movements.
Thanks. And that's helpful because it tees up my second question, and it strikes me that alignment, especially between government and business, would be critical for South Korea to obtain some of those broader goals that you mentioned early on about playing from this foundation of sort of technological and innovative strength and helping to shape regional dynamics. You mentioned ASEAN in your remarks.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you've got a sense of how active and how effective South Korea's regional role has been, not just within ASEAN, but also with the APEC discussions that are taking place right now, some of the broader conversations taking place about digital trade and data transfers across the Asia-Pacific region. Your implication is that South Korea really needs to continue stepping up its game in order to kind of continue punching above its weight.
Yeah.
Do you think that Seoul is going to be able to achieve that, given some of the broader dynamics at play and some of the bigger players who are active in this space across the Asia-Pacific region?
I think it can achieve it for some very specific reasons. It does have a long way to go in a couple of spaces. And in particular, when you mentioned ASEAN, I was thinking of this annual survey that's put out by a major think tank in Singapore that surveys representatives from across ASEAN on their views of both ASEAN and other major powers that are active in the region. So Japan and the United States frequently make this list. India, sometimes the European Union is based in these questions. And it's very stark to see that South Korea is often not ranked very highly in ASEAN views of influence in the region. There are questions in particular that say, who do you see as kind of your top advocate for promoting free trade? Who do you see as a key advocate of the rule of law in the region? Even some of these areas where you think that, and even expanding it to the question of, well, who do you see as a potential partner in balancing against US-China dynamics in particular? Again, South Korea ranks quite low on the list. But I think interestingly, there is one exception to this survey where South Korea ranks very highly, and that's in the view of South Korean firms and kind of their competitiveness, their interest in the market. So to that end, I think some of the movement that we've seen on South Korea trying to do more within ASEAN to create these public-private frameworks, dialogues where it can more directly bring in industry, do industry matchmaking, are some cases not as mature efforts as they could be, but they're positive efforts that seem to have a foundation for building support. More broadly, though, there are a number of institutions where South Korea has had a degree of influence on both agenda setting and then also norm setting. And you mentioned APEC in particular, where South Korea has been very active in the Telecommunications Committee, working both independently, but sometimes in coordination with the United States to elevate the attention that 5G issues have had within the forum. So not always advocating or necessarily winning the day on a specific argument for what that system should look like, but making sure that it is a conversation that happens at the strategic level.
Thank you. And then let me take the prerogative of the moderator's chair and ask one more question of you before you bring our other guests into the discussion here. This is all obviously taking place in a broader environment where the US-China relationship has become much more competitive, and where talk of decoupling of the economies or sort of bigger barriers between the two are obviously there. And we know that Seoul has always faced this challenge of maintaining, good, productive ties with a large neighbor next door, which is an important trading partner, as well as the strong alliance relationship with the United States. Specifically in this area of say 5G, for instance, how has Seoul been challenged by the broader sort of storm that's been brewing across the region as the US-China relationship has deteriorated, and how well is the Moon administration responding to those sets of challenges?
It has been impacted, and sometimes at this stage, it's been more the concern of the ripple effects of how it would be impacted rather than an actual tangible impact in the same way that you've seen in Taiwan or some other places on specific restrictions of products. Earlier this year, we convened a roundtable where we looked at particularly how the US actions towards Huawei have impacted South Korean supply chains. And the end result of that conversation was essentially saying, not much yet, maybe more in the coming years, but in terms of actual pain points, the Moon administration has not faced necessarily that pain point where a decision has to be made that will have immediate consequences, but that idea of what those consequences could be and the idea that there is that looming element out there of a decision point has weighed in particular on the Moon administration, as well as South Korean policy at large. One of the critiques that we heard quite frequently at an early stage in this project was not that South Korea was so like-minded with Chinese policies in these spaces, or it was necessarily opposed to the idea of thinking about vendor security as an important dynamic. South Korea actually has a network law that manages flows through communication networks that says you have to put in place restrictions that are both physical and policy-wise for managing these security elements. So rather, the concern was the idea that this was a little bit more politicized and not based on an evidence-based framework that had led to the conclusion that Huawei, or rather Chinese firms at large, posed a security threat. And that was kind of the rejoinder that we kept hearing repeatedly. We're happy to respond to this. Give us the evidence-based framework. Give us the clear evidence or the decision that we can use that's vendor neutral. And some of that was always a little unfair. I think the US side response would be, here is some of the evidence, we've showed you the evidence, or rather, you have also experienced some of the evidence and how this has been used against you. But nonetheless, you do see this conversation kind of repeating these loops for the last few years. That's also shifted a little bit, I think particularly in the last year. And it's hard to point to any single factor on why that's occurred, if it's changes in Chinese policy, if it's the change in US administration and kind of the view that some of these policies might be here to stay, or a view that there is a movement on this evidence-based approach. There's also the fact that ASEAN does these fantastic annual surveys. You also see South Korean public opinion souring towards China on a number of fronts. Still much more positive in general than US public opinion towards China, but nonetheless a notable drop, which has to influence in some ways national policy. And I think you see some of this come to the head in the Moon-Biden statement last month, where China may not have been explicitly mentioned, but some of the language on ORAN, some of the language on thinking about methods for reviewing foreign investment in this space, all have kind of a natural implication that also Chinese stakeholders were not surprised. I mean, responded very vocally in the press too. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take a bit of a back seat now, Clara, and let you introduce our other two speakers and continue the conversation. I would encourage our audience members, if you have questions about Clara's presentation and the conversation so far, or the conversation that we'll be continuing here, please do channel those through the chat function, and Clara will be able to kind of field those as we continue our discussion today. Clara, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this next session, where we have really two fantastic panelists looking at South Korea at the nexus of some of these technological, geopolitical, and innovation themes that have already come up in my discussion. For many of you, both of our panelists need no introductions, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative of just a relatively brief introduction of both of them. Our first speaker will be Guanhu Li, who's the professor and chair of the Department of Information Technology and Analytics at American University. He's also previously served as a consultant to both the World Bank and Samsung, so has a wealth of experience translating some of these ideas into actual action and decision-making that influence development processes in very real ways. Next, then, we will have Troy Stangerone, who is a senior director and fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. Prior to this, he brings experience from working up on the Hill for Senator Robert Torcelli, looking at trade and foreign policy topics. Many of you will know Troy is, I think, always in the news, and the person I turn to in particular for trying to understand some of these dynamics of what we might see in the Moon administration in particular. So really great that we're going to have a lot of ground to cover. I've asked each of our speakers to talk for roughly 8 to 10 minutes and to dive right in with Guanhu. When I think of some of these technological and data governance questions in the last year, the big issue that always comes up is what we've seen in these COVID era applications. I'm particularly thinking about big data at scale as a tool for addressing public health dynamics. I know you have an upcoming piece of your own in this space. I'm hoping that you can share a little bit more of your research and findings with us.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Clara. My presentation today focuses on South Korea's COVID-19 contact tracing system. I call the system CCTS for short. I have a slide deck I'd like to show the audience. Yeah, that looks great. Excellent. Thank you so much. So this system called CCTS is a great example that showcases how South Korea's advanced digital systems and infrastructures, combined with its data privacy legislation and strong public-private partnerships, enabled a rapid development of contact tracing system. Next slide, please. Next. South Korea quickly and effectively contained the COVID-19 pandemic last year. Although many policies and initiatives contribute to South Korea's successful response to the pandemic, digital technology was at the core of the endeavors. As part of its 3T strategy, test, trace, and treat, for coping with COVID-19, South Korea deployed a software system that traces the contacts of infected patients and disseminates the information in a matter of minutes. The system, CCTS, contribute to dramatically reducing the number of daily new confirmed cases from about 900 on February 29th last year to about only 7 cases on April 29th same year. According to a recent Columbia University study, both South Korea and the US confirmed their very first case of coronavirus on the exactly same day in 2020. However, as of March 2020, South Korea's total confirmed cases were less than 10,000, and its proportional mortality rate was 50 times smaller than the rate of the US. The CCTS was instrumental for enabling public healthcare officials to make informed decisions and making the public aware of high-risk places that are exposed to the virus. The information provided by the CCTS helped citizens avoid hotspots and plan their outdoor activities accordingly. Other countries also implemented similar various mobile apps for contact tracing. However, almost all of them struggled with a low user adoption rate, which made tracing incomplete and not very useful. By contrast, unlike those mobile apps, CCTS does not need citizens to install any app to trace contacts. Next slide, please. Well, instead, CCTS, the system collects data directly from mobile carriers, 3 major mobile carriers in South Korea, and several credit card companies without requiring any actions from users. The system reduced the time to complete tracing one confirmed case from more than 24 hours to less than 10 minutes, almost real time. The development of the system required intensive public-private collaboration among multiple players, including central government, local government, wireless carriers, credit card companies, software companies, startups, a research institute, and even a university. The system is actually a very complex system in integrating multiple data sources. That said, it is really remarkable that it took only 1 month to design and develop and deploy the entire system nationwide. Next slide, please. I'm not going to get into technical details, but I'd like to show a high-level view of the data flow and work process of the system. The system replaced the previous manual process for collecting, analyzing, and disclosing the data relevant to newly confirmed cases. When a new confirmed case occurs, the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as KCDC, enters the relevant information to the system. Then an epidemic investigator requests the mobile location data and credit card usage data through the system. Then the police department and credit finance association almost instantly approve the request. Then the mobile carriers and credit card companies retrieve the requested data from their own databases and upload them onto the system, CCTS system, using standard data format and APIs. The data then is converted, stored, and maintained in the data platform for the system. And then the system accesses the data via APIs and analyze them and disclose the result to the public through websites and text messages and other channels. Now, the high adoption rates of credit cards and mobile phones in South Korea really made it possible for this system to trace most of the infected individuals accurately. On average, South Korean possesses about 2 credit cards and makes payments with credit cards 65% of the time if the amount is greater than $10 US. And as Clara briefly mentioned earlier, South Korea's mobile phone penetration rate for adults is actually 100%, with smartphones accounting for 95%, which is the world best. An individual's mobile location data and credit card usage data are matched and aggregated by the South Korea's national identification number that is unique to each and every resident. Next slide, please. So these figures show the 3 types of results produced by the system. The system produces not only the tracking information of a confirmed case, the first figure, but also 2 additional results. Second figure shows hotspots. Hotspots refer to areas highly vulnerable to mass infection. The system can identify hotspots by overlaying cumulative confirmed cases spatio-temporally. The information on hotspots is useful for the government to deploy resources to the right communities and for the right citizens to avoid social activities in high-risk areas. The third figure shows a visual presentation of the routes by which COVID-19 patients got infected. That is, this infographic shows who infected whom and where. So this information provides very useful insights into how the virus spreads through a network of certain people and certain places. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the critical success factors for this system. The first factor is advanced mobile computing infrastructure. A software system that creates public value relies on the nationwide technology infrastructure. South Korea's advanced mobile computing environment served as an essential foundation for CCTS. The high 4G and 5G coverage, combined with the high adoption rate of smartphones, made it possible to collect accurate location information of nearly all infected patients. The second factor has to do with data platform. The system was not created from scratch. It was actually built upon an existing platform for smart city applications. The data platform provides a technical framework and APIs that enable easy and fast connection integration of new data sources with proven and certified cybersecurity measures. So by taking advantage of this existing data platform, the project team was able to speed up the development of the system and complete the project within 1 month. Next factor is agility and flexibility. The idea for the system was originated from the manager who oversaw a completely different project, which was a smart city project. When the smart city team faced unforeseen roadblock to their pilot study because of the pandemic, the team started brainstorming alternative actions. The project manager quickly realized that many of the key ingredients required for developing a contact tracing system were already available in their system, in their platform, or could be made available very quickly through the public-private partnerships that the Smart City project has forged over the last few years. So with this breakthrough insight, the Smart City team repurposed its resources and mobilized partnering organizations to develop the CCTS system. Next factor is dedicated software developers. The developers of the system understood how serious the pandemic was and how important it was to deliver the system as quickly as possible. South Koreans learned from their previous experience with the 2015 MERS outbreak that an outbreak of a new virus could severely harm not only the economy, but also the society as a whole. So this shared sense of crisis and urgency motivated software developers to make system development top priority and work long hours even during the weekend to get things done as quickly as possible. Next factor has to do with legal framework. Clara touched on this earlier. After experiencing the MERS outbreak, South Korea amended two laws: the Infectious Disease Prevention and Control Act and the Enforcement Decree of the Infectious Disease Prevention and Control Act. With these amendments, the government could legally collect infectious disease patients' data, and also the law also allows the government to disclose the data depending on the severity of the outbreak. So without such a law in place, it would have been impossible for implementing the full functionalities of the system. Last but not least, effective public-private partnership. As I mentioned earlier, the development of the system required collaboration among many players from the public and private sectors. Without effective collaboration, the system would not have been made possible. But it is not easy for software developers from very different organizations to work together harmoniously. However, their prior work experience with the Smart City project helped them kick off a head start and set up ground rules for collaboration. In addition, the central government was also instrumental in facilitating collaboration by quickly clearing up budgetary barriers. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. So in terms of South Korea's global leadership in this space, well, the world quickly came to notice the success of the context tracing system of South Korea. And in fact, the Republic of South Africa and several countries in Latin America have asked South Korea to help them develop similar context tracing systems. So the conversation kicked off. However, South Korea's system was developed and optimized for its very unique digital systems infrastructure and legal systems. So that made it a little bit difficult to adapt the system to other countries very quickly. However, recently, South Korean government allocated budget to support a project that makes the system more flexible and easier to be adapted to other countries' conditions. So once this project is complete, I think the Korean government will collaborate with other countries to help develop contact tracing systems. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Guanto. That was fantastic. And it's such a really fascinating application that we were not necessarily expecting to see in the last year. And as you noted, came together shockingly quickly too. I was pleased to hear you mention the Smart Cities Hub as something that was already in train and that kind of enabled this immediate ramp up, which, you know, before I turn to Troy, actually leads me to a question that I wanted to ask you, which is, for everything that you described, kind of the collection of data from these different sources, GPS, credit card, others, and the application of sharing them among these stakeholders for a specific purpose, how much of this is always possible, and how much of what you're discussing in the system is uniquely possible because of the crisis nature of COVID? So a year or two from now, the question is, okay, well, what happens to the system? How is it used? Love your thoughts there.
Yeah, thank you for the great question. Yeah, of course, the Korean people's concern about privacy actually has been growing over the last several years. So government was responding to the people's concern about the data privacy issues. However, as I mentioned earlier, South Korea experienced a couple of outbreaks, epidemics, including MERS and SARS. And then through that process, they learned that when they deal with unprecedented, natural disasters or pandemic, they need to be a little bit more flexible in terms of sharing, a little bit sensitive data. So laws that I mentioned, the amendments actually made it possible to collect and share the data on a limited basis. But of course, the laws also require the system operators to store and keep the data in a very certain way so that data doesn't get out of the system. So that being said, I don't expect the Korean government to abuse citizens' private data unless they have to, unless they are allowed by the law to do that. So I think it's a balance that we need to strike. And then actually, in fact, the Korean government and also some researchers did some survey study with Korean people about how they feel about collecting data and their personal data and then using the data to control the pandemic. And surprisingly, majority of people were okay with it. So yeah.
I was going to say that touches on to some of the questions I've already seen we're getting in the chat box that I wanted to follow up on you here too, which is if you can expand a little bit more on some of those guardrails that you mentioned. In particular, how do you square the application of this system in a democracy with still maintaining good safeguards around individual privacy rights, and as well as data protection as well, preventing this not just from the hands that it's going into, their misuse, but others accessing it as well?
Yeah, so of course, the CCTS, the context tracing system, received some critics from around the world because of the privacy issue. And then, they are not free from criticism. But as I mentioned earlier, they did what they could do in terms of protecting privacy within the legal system they have. For example, they use a separate network that is completely separate from the public network to actually store the data and use the data. So that unless you break into of course, nothing is impossible these days, but unless you break into the separate network, it's impossible to access the data. So they try to deploy measures to protect the data security and privacy. But of course, as anything can be possible. Virtually all systems can be hacked. So there is a possibility that the sensitive citizen data could get out of the system. But my understanding is the Korean government did due diligence to make sure that the privacy is well protected.
I was also struck when you mentioned the surveys that I've seen too, showing the high degree of public support in South Korea for the use of these applications, in particular for these specific circumstances. And it made me think of the flip side of this that we've seen in the last year too, which is South Korea does have a very robust legal system. And as part of this, it does have a number of feedback mechanisms where there have been public cases brought to constitutional courts, other mechanisms to refine how some of this data is collected and used. So the initial month, you saw a lot made out of the very specific, easily re-identifiable options of showing some of those local spread, the hotspots, then having a number of cases brought through the processes that citizens are allowed to approach to push back on that, which led to kind of an interesting give and take on this of how you refine some of these systems in line with your democratic mandate. I feel like I have 5 more questions, and I know we're getting some other ones in the chat too. So I want to come back to you, but maybe even picking up on some of those comments of, well, how do you take these practices? How do you look about them in a larger global sphere? Troy, you have looked extensively at South Korean approaches to the region, both in terms of trade and foreign policy more broadly. I'd love to hear your thoughts of some of the questions of where we go from here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Clara, for having me on today. It's good to be here with you and Dr. Lee. And maybe what I'll do, I'd like to actually step back and sort of touch a little bit more on, a part of the conversation you had earlier with Michael when he asked about sort of the give and take between government and business, because I think actually the anecdote you used about ride sharing sort of is a good way to sort of look at how South Korea is going to face these challenges and what challenges it has. when we think about the South Korean economy and companies in South Korea, the large chaebol are still largely, not totally, but largely, hardware industrial companies. They're not really software firms. Samsung is trying to move into more software. It's very interested in things like the Internet of Things. But at the end of the day, these are still really hardware firms. The sort of two large upcoming software firms, if you will, in South Korea are Naver, which has been around for a while, and more recently Kakao. And Kakao was one of the companies that was looking to do a ride-sharing app. And so you had talked earlier about the issue of things being global. And having been to South Korea quite frequently, I'm not sure that Uber or Uber-style model really works in Korea. Taxis are fairly cheap. It might be hard for people to compete in ride sharing with taxis as it is. It's more about really the convenience of being able to get a vehicle when you want a vehicle as opposed to price. So I can see a system to where, and the taxi companies there are thinking about doing this as well, moving into that. But the challenge is that Kakao isn't going to be able to really get up the type of ride sharing program they would need to develop the data and then spread that out into other markets. So, Uber is in a lot of different markets around the world. You have different companies like Lyft as well that are, US-based companies and some others. But so it's going to be difficult, I think, when you have this sort of give and take where you have these up-and-coming software firms who maybe want to move into sort of industries, need to have the domestic market to really sort of build up, get some of the data they need to refine their products, be able to move into other markets. And that's going to be the challenge. So I think really the question is going to be, as we move towards more software, more database applications, especially even as we move in on the industrial manufacturing side, the clear example of this is autonomous vehicles, to where you're going to have lots of data. You're going to need the 5G infrastructure South Korea has, but all those things have to come together with the hardware components to take and really produce the types of vehicles we might be seeing in probably more likely a decade, not maybe sooner than that. But this is going to be the challenge. Where is the software side on the South Korean end going to come from at the end of the day? And maybe it'll come through partnerships with other companies in other countries. But I think that's really when we're talking about data and global digital leadership, really kind of the challenge for South Korea. But what I'd like to do, with that being said, is to take and go through and really touch on three different things. The New Southern Policy, which you touched on as well earlier on, the Digital New Deal, and South Korea's artificial intelligence goals. Each of these fit into sort of larger areas that had been identified by the Moon administration early on for either economic growth or foreign policy, but they also fit together. And they've been driven forward really more recently by the pandemic as well. Part of the New South Policy Plus is really adding on the digital component, and that's really been sort of taken and highlighted because of the challenges of, one, delivering healthcare, managing the pandemic, trying to take and move things into the digital realm that we've seen during the pandemic. And so as we look at this, there's really been this shift that we're seeing. And for South Korea and even ASEAN to an extent, there is a logic to regional cooperation. South Korea has been trying to take and diversify its partners. The United States, over the last 4 or 5 years, has been less reliable in terms of how economically and even on the security level it has performed with South Korea. You also have the issue of THAAD and the economic retaliation that took place from its deployment with China. And so South Korea is looking to try and take and become less dependent on what traditionally had been its two largest, most important economic markets. And so ASEAN is really where it's looking. And there's also, when you look at this from the ASEAN perspective, also trying to diversify a bit away, not get caught up in the tech war with the United States and China. And so South Korea there is actually one of the potential partners for them to try and help achieve that. And when you think about this, they had the ASEAN summit last year in November. There was an agreement that was reached to cooperate more on the digital level, including South Korean support for ASEAN's Master Digital Plan 2025. Within that specifically, there's talk about cooperation in areas of 5G, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. And this is where you had mentioned the State of Southeast Asia survey in 2020. There's a specific question related to 5G deployment. And really, Samsung is the preferred partner over Huawei or any other Chinese vendors of countries in Southeast Asia. So I think that there is potential for cooperation there. You have good opportunities even on the US side with South Korea, because we can take it now through changing our own domestic laws, finance foreign companies for 5G infrastructure elsewhere. So there is this potential to where you have a product that is wanted in the region from South Korea, one that potentially the US can help finance. You can see greater US cooperation in this area as well within the region. But at the same time, you know, there is an element of more work that needs to be done in terms of US cooperation with South Korea and ASEAN through really trying to work and bring together the new Southern policy, excuse me, and as well our own Indo-Pacific strategy. And we see some of this in the recent US-Korea summit, where an agreement to cooperate more on digital capacity and cybersecurity in ASEAN. It's not 100% clear yet how that's going to be actualized, but it's clearly an area where both governments have been talking for a while. There's clear interest in trying to sync policies, and there's benefits for both potentially. That being said, I think going forward, we're going to see an effort by South Korea to try and maintain some distance, because you do have this issue of how sensitive will China be on some of these issues, specifically, you know, when it comes to 5G and semiconductors and some of the other high-tech areas. That being said, when we look at artificial intelligence, this is one of the key areas. PricewaterhouseCoopers had estimated that, in essence, over the next decade, artificial intelligence is going to add about $15 trillion to the global economy. This is an area where South Korea is clearly willing to, or interested in trying to take and advance itself, but it's also one to where it faces real challenges. There's a artificial intelligence plan that came out just before the pandemic. It set 100 specific goals for South Korea across 3 different areas, including AI competitiveness, scale, AI utilization, and a people-centered approach. The people-centered approach largely dealing with things like government services, healthcare, and trying to take and make the best out of AI for people's lives. They also are looking to become a top 3 country in terms of AI competitiveness. In both doing this, they're looking to take and advance technological development, but also improve the regulatory environment to take and make AI applications more easier to take and develop within the country and to experiment in different things. We've seen this to where you're also creating different zones for experimentation as well within South Korea. So there has been some government policy movement on this area, but really the AI plan was largely overrun over time by the pandemic. You see, as part of its own recovery, South Korea is really trying to look towards the future. What is the post-pandemic economy going to look like? And this is where we get to the Digital New Deal. And so the Digital New Deal is really about trying to take and unify infrastructure, so 5G, artificial intelligence applications, and industry. And within that context, the government is looking to take and get up online about 12,000 smart factories. So this would be where you'd have companies utilize artificial intelligence to take and improve not just production, but as we've seen during the pandemic, where you had supply chain challenges, also be able to quickly take and adjust production to different types of products or different components to take and deal with the shifts from disruptions within the supply chain itself. So it's a movement to taking and integrating that type of data and that type of manufacturing to be more efficient and more fleet of foot. But at the same time, there's also an effort to take and really tap into the data side of things. South Korea is estimated in a Harvard Business Review study to be the 5th largest producer of data in the world. But a lot of this data isn't standardized, it's not very usable, and it's not accessible by small companies. And so they're really looking to take and create what they're calling a data dam, which would be a standardized set of data that would be accessible to SMEs, so that way they could develop their own AI applications and really try and take and help those new companies develop new products going forward. This actually has some potential implications for broader Korea-ASEAN applications, and it gets to the issues across data flows that you mentioned earlier as well, which is that if you could successfully develop a data hub in South Korea, one of the things about artificial intelligence is that, some of this is essentially a brute force application of over and over trying to take and learn from different amounts of data. And some of this is about having large amounts of data to see new patterns that might not exist. We've seen AI famously applied in South Korea at the beginning of the pandemic when a test kit was developed through the use of artificial intelligence early on. But if you're really going to take and sort of expand out and touch, whether this is in pharmaceutical industry to try and find new innovative drugs, whether this is new applications on things like how to keep improving semiconductors, whether it's really moving into other types of fields, you're really going to need access to more data. And while South Korea is one of the world's larger data producers, China, the United States, and the European Union are all going to have much larger access to data from their own domestic markets. You have a situation to where South Korea really is going to need to have access to other markets' data. One option is potentially to have some type of collaboration with ASEAN and have a larger data market. And so if South Korea is successful domestically, perhaps you could see the creation of some type of standardized rules across Korea and ASEAN that would take and allow for cross data flows between the two. And that would then take and give both sides greater access to data to help them improve their products and have new different types of innovations. And so ultimately, there is a way to take and sort of marry the domestic policies that South Korea has, be it either in AI or the Digital New Deal, with its new Southern Policy Plus with ASEAN, to where you could try and meet the goals of helping ASEAN become, a digital society, take and gain access to a large amount of data, and improve your ability to utilize AI going forward. And I think, one of the real challenges South Korea has is that they have a one-term presidency. So a lot of this is going to depend on who the next president is. But if you have the maintenance of good policy structures and the next administration follows through on those, there are some real opportunities here for South Korea to do some interesting things in Southeast Asia and perhaps beyond.
Thank you, Troy. That was fantastic, and a number of really excellent points I know we're going to come back to in the discussion as well. But one thing I wanted to pick up on that you just said, that South Korea needs more access to data, and specifically quality data. With the recent announcement on Advocacy with the EU GDPR and its counterpart in South Korea, how significant is that decision and the potential for increased flows between the two economies there? Is this a significant development? Is it a starting point? How much does that fill the concern that you're looking at?
I think we need to see how this plays out. GDPR is very complex. It's something the United States and the EU are going to fight over. My instinct is that what South Korea and probably other countries want is something that is ultimately between GDPR and the United States. So more protections than the US and US firms would want, but less, say, than Europeans would want. And so I think the challenge is going to be with GDPR is, does that then end up filtering through South Korea's broader data policies? If so, does that create restrictions elsewhere? And if it doesn't, then do the Europeans, and the Europeans have brought up on, for example, labor rights conventions that South Korea is supposed to implement under their FTA, that they hadn't, they took them to dispute settlement over it. So will you then see the EU take and pull back on data sharing? So I think we really need to see how this ends up operating and what it means sort of for South Korea's broader data policies before we know if it really can sort of answer that data access question.
Thank you, Troy. And I see that we have a number of questions coming in through the chat. We're also getting very close to our time. So I have a number of additional ones, but I think I might turn to, on our staff, Jonathan Merrick, who's been collecting some of these questions to see if he wants to intervene with raising any in particular. And if not, I've seen a couple I want to single out as well, just building on points for both of you. Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you, Clara. So one question that was raised earlier is, we're seeing South Korea playing an increasing role, but also that there are other regional powers and global powers with different views. So how similar are South Korea's policy preferences to those of the EU in terms of GDPR and emphasis on privacy protections versus China and also countries like India that emphasize data sovereignty. And then I'll just add in versus countries like the United States or Japan that have really emphasized the free flow of data.
So I guess having touched on the GDPR side, I'll really focus on the question of data sovereignty. There has been sort of this push to try and keep Korean data within South Korea. I wouldn't say it's necessarily as strong as you see in maybe China, and I know less about India, so I wouldn't want to comment on that specifically. But there is a sense of that. That being said, I think from South Korea's own perspective in terms of economic development going forward and making sure they are at the cutting edge a lot of these things, there's probably going to need to be more flexibility. And I mean, you already have, like, one of the challenges is, like, under the course FTA, banks are allowed to take and bring data back to the United States for processing and analysis and everything. So some of this they've kind of already had built into the system where they're going to need to be able to share the data, at least in certain fields. But I do think ultimately they'll need to probably be more flexible than what they've shown so far.
May I interject a point? So build upon Troy's point. Well, in terms of data protection, historically, South Korea was more like EU in that they had very restrictive privacy laws in place early on, focusing on protecting privacy. But when big data era came, they really quickly realized that in order to create value out of big data, then privacy law was too restrictive. So they were trying to making the data access a little bit easier for scientific research and statistical analysis so that we can create value out of the big data. So I would say that they are moving away from EU model, but going a little bit toward the US model in that they want to have more flexibility in accessing data without compromising data privacy issues too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say I agree with both of our panelists there that if you look at the areas of similarity and kind of divergence between the South Korea and other major economies, much more areas of shared values with some of the other democracies, some of the other, such as the European Union, US, and Japan, on not just some of the abstract goals, but in terms of the language and ways that things have been operationalized in its privacy legislation, the way that you think about what counts as sensitive versus personal, how things are categorized, and then also movement through these trade agreements to further harmonize what the standards are for allowing cross-border data flows. Yeah, I was curious by a couple of the questions that we got in the chat as well, of talking about data protectionism, or in some cases, data protection by other means that might be discouraged or that might be against some of the US views and others on it. And interestingly, less, in my view, that Korea is more similar to China or India on these views of data sovereignty, and more that for how some of these policies are executed, there's a bit of an ambiguous gray area, particularly when you come to what some of the national security exemptions are. You see this between the US and China, or the US and Korea on views of China, but you also see it on North Korea as another example of something where South Korea has used this as a baseline justification for restricting some of the export of its geographic data in particular. And a couple of debates back and forth of whether this is the appropriate tool, or to some of the points Troy raised as well, if this is another effort to give a boost to domestic companies through another mean by creating a competitive advantage. I wanted to return there a little bit because I think it came up in both of your remarks in different ways too, which is this idea that South Korea has really led on the hardware side. You have some very innovative and really impressive government-backed efforts to build up new applications, but also still struggling on the software side in terms of the role that the private sector can play in this space. Is there a specific role that public policy either could or should be doing more on to address these issues? Troy, I know you mentioned the data dam. Are there other things that you might see there? Guanhu, you talked a little bit about some of the public-private partnerships. How does this get sustained, or how do some of these benefits continue to expand beyond into new applications while maintaining those kind of questions about managing data privacy as well?
So I guess one thing that I would say is that if you look at South Korean government policy, it's traditionally been focused towards, ensuring strong manufacturing competitiveness. So some of this is almost a, not ideational, but almost a government shift in terms of philosophy. What do we really need to be trying to take and ensuring we have a proper space for? So in that context, it's about really creating the environment for these new types of firms to develop. So, like I mentioned, cacao is a relatively new firm. It would be, I actually think, really good if we saw some more. And there are some startups in this area that look promising and everything, but if we can start seeing more firms develop the software side. And part of that, I also think, is that for whatever reason, we've been, or not we, but Korea's been fortunate that, Samsung, LG, or someone didn't go to try and buy out Naver or Kakao. And so I think that's going to be a key too, that we don't see any of the traditional, more industrial chaebols start buying up a lot of the promising software firms. So it's about, giving them the space to grow, having the proper policies in place for them to grow, and then ensuring that, they're allowed to actually, if you will, come to maturity.
Yeah, to add to that, as Troy offered an excellent insight of South Korea's industry strength in terms of hardware rather than software. As Clara mentioned, I advised Samsung for their digital strategy for 4 years in the past, and then I observed that they were trying to build a capability in the software space, but didn't succeed very well. And then that's the case for not only for Samsung, but also for LG and Hyundai and SK to some extent. So they realized that their strength is not really software making, but it's hardware making. So they want to continue to do what they're good at. So that being said, significant software companies or capabilities, I doubt they will come out of large companies like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai. Maybe we should look at the companies like Naver and Kakao, as Troy mentioned. Full disclosure, the founder and the chairman of Kakao is a good friend of mine. We went to the same university, same department for 5 years. We studied together. He's 1 year senior to me. But the problem with companies like Kakao and the Naver, the Korean software companies, they were focusing on domestic markets so far. They were not able to enter global markets successfully yet for many different reasons. So one thing the Korean government can do is find a way to make it easier for them to enter global market, whether they support the talents, whether they support logistical barriers. That way, companies like Kakao and even startup softwares might be able to step up to be a global leader in software space. So that's my hope.
No, that's a great reply. And I see we're running a little bit over, and so I'm going to very quickly turn it to Michael in just a minute. But if I can, I might stretch a little bit to ask both of you one last final, maybe 30-second question. And it hits on something that Troy raised in particular, which is we are now less than a year out for an election in Korea that will see a new administration come in and potentially a dramatically changed set of policies, even if it might be from the same party as the President Moon Jae-in. With that kind of potential switch in mind, what do you realistically see as happening in, say, the next 6 months, or that could happen, or that should be prioritized to keep moving forward on some of these things that we've talked about as being seemingly an interesting trajectory and a potential for South Korea to play a larger role?
So I think one area where you can see consistency, or should see consistency, is in US-Korea cooperation on some of these issues. we mentioned that some of this came out of the summit. Any new administration that comes in is going to want to take and continue that cooperation. So that's one way to sort of, lock a few things in. But beyond that, I think it can be challenging. I remember talking to a senior official in the Park Geun-hye government just before the election in 2012. I asked them about Lee Myung-bak's Global Korea, if they're going to keep it, and basically their response was, we feel that the Lee administration is focused too much on the world and not enough on North Korea, and we need to adjust. So even when you have people from the same political party, they can decide they want to shift what their priority is. And so I think that's the real challenge. And so some of it is by locking in cooperation with others to try and keep things in place, but it's going to be a challenge, I think.
Well, being a business school professor, I don't know if I'm an expert at that geopolitical issue, but China, the tension between the two countries really put a lot of pressure on South Korean government as well as South Korean companies. So they continue to monitor the tension and the relationship and try to make adjustment to have a good terms with both countries, and also the promote the South Korean business and economy. That being said, next 6 months will be critical, because right now the Korean political climate is very, very uncertain with a lot of factors at work. But one thing I could say is that regardless of who's going to be the next administration, I think the digital industry will be one of the top priority, because that's what South Korea has to do, because that's what South Korea is good at, and then I think that will remain as a consistent policy.
That's really the perfect note to end on. I'm going to turn things back over to Michael, but first, just want to thank both of you for really excellent remarks.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I'm going to continue that theme, actually. Thank all of you who've taken the time today to watch this discussion and participate by asking your questions through the chat and the Q&A function. I'd like to thank the Korea Foundation, whose grant made this research possible and this event possible. I'd like to thank my colleagues at NBR, all the unsung heroes behind the scenes who put an event like this together. And our three speakers today, Guan-Hu, Troy, and Clara, for their wonderful and informative remarks. Clara's research report will be published by NBR later this year. If you're interested in reading something now, her report from the first stage of this project, Network Benefits, is available on the NBR website, as well as a lot of other research that we've been undertaking over the last few years on data governance and innovation across the Asia-Pacific region. So I encourage you to go to www.nbr.org. You can find all of our publicly available information there, and we encourage you to keep returning for conversations like this in the future. But thanks again, everyone, for participating with us today.
Thank you.